This was a week all about three things: budget, budget, budget. Well, we had budget over here, then we had reality over here. The two things didn't actually overlap. There are two levels of unreality about the budget. Now governments are talking about projecting things out 10 years. Does anyone seriously believe that any of those projections are going to be meaningful at all once we get out that far? To talk about a surplus in 10 years' time is just certainly lost all touch with reality. And secondly, it's always the case with the numbers themselves. The one thing you know about every budget is that the specific numbers in the budget are exactly the ones that won't actually happen. Take the deficit, projected deficit. The one thing you know, whatever it is, might be higher, it might finish lower. The one thing it will not finish is the number projected in the deficit, in the budget. Yes, obviously the policy changes or proposals in the budget are very real, and they're certainly real to those people that they will hit. Recipients of welfare on the one hand, all of us through the indexation of petrol and the temporary deficit levy on very high income earners, subject of course to what gets through the Senate. Now I have to say that despite the comments that we face a turbulent, unpredictable time with the Senate, because we now have a buffoon named Clive Palmer having a significant role in decision making, personally I prefer the buffoon we know than the Labor-Green alliance controlling the Senate that we also know that would stop any sensible change taking place and would vote for the easy options. Yes, Clive is going to be difficult. Yes, Clive is going to want to extract a price, but at least the government now has some chance of passing some of the important measures that it wants to pass. The one true reality out of this budget was that there are two things in life that are certain: taxes and bracket creep. I guess death is also still certain, but certainly in fiscal terms it's taxes and bracket creep. Despite all the noise generated about the cuts, the single biggest contribution to cutting the deficit is going to be bracket creep. The increase in income tax payable, not just when you move up a bracket, but simply when you get an increase in income. Bracket creep is going to deliver something like $20 billion extra revenue to the government over the course of the next 4 years, whoever is in power at the end of all this. The other striking figure is that income tax receipts are going to leap in total by an astonishing $60 billion over the 4 years. They're going to be up by well over 1/3 the level that they are today. That's the primary reality of this budget: increased taxation. And at the end of that process, we have this, end of those 4 years, we have this proposal to push spending back to the states, which could only be funded by an increase in the GST. So one reality is we're going to be paying more and more income tax over the next 4 years. Again, whichever side is in power at the end of this process, we then face the reality that we'll be lucky to get income tax cuts, we'll be lucky to get some of that bracket creep back, but we almost certainly would have to pay for it with GST, a higher GST. And in my judgment, looking at our ageing population, looking at the reality of government spending, which tends to increase, we will face both. We will face having to continue to pay the higher income tax and the GST, and the higher GST. Now, that was the budget. Over here we had reality. And really there are two major realities bearing down on the economy and so on all of you out there. One is China. It's looking increasingly like China is going to be slowing, that the expectations of sustained strong growth out of China will not be realised, that we'll be lucky to see China growing at 7% a year, which in our terms would be fantastic. In their terms, it's barely getting out of a crawl. They won't be growing certainly at double digits, and they probably won't even be growing at 8%, which has been the experience of the last couple of years. So slower growth out of China will have a big, big impact on the Australian economy. It'll also feed into those budget numbers, making them probably worse than they look now. The other reality is the US. There are two sort of realities in relation to the US. One, the Fed will continue to taper. It'll go methodically through that process, so there'll be no more QE by the end of the year, and then it will be thinking about interest rate rises. But that's the second reality. What is actually going to be happening to the US economy? Will it be sustaining its recovery? Again, the messages out of the US are very mixed. It's certainly not experiencing the fantastic springback that it has out of every previous recession since the Second World War, but there is some sort of recovery going on. You'd expect that there'd be some sort of recovery considering the huge stimulus that's been pouring into the US economy, but it doesn't really look that great. So those are the two realities that are really going to determine what happens to Australia and what happens to the budget numbers. Finally, we saw BHP continuing to dance around its proposal to hive off all its unproductive operations. Andrew McKenzie, the CEO, was talking about the simplification process through the week. Simplification, otherwise translated, is hiving off all the crap, more formally known as Billiton. All those assets it acquired when it bought Billiton back at the turn of the century. Well, when the old BHP merged with Billiton back at the turn of the century. So the share price, BHP's share price, is up around 2% over the week. Not reflecting that primarily, just simply the broader context of this is a company which is getting about doing at the corporate level, cutting back the waste, making itself more productive that the government should be doing and talks about doing at the national level. The other reality was, of course, the banks keep powering on, led by the CBA, which is way out in front. Its share price went through $80, hitting a new record. It's way out in front on earnings. It's close to 18% return on shareholders' funds, way above the other three banks. And despite all this talk about our banks all being the same, all being copies of each other, we're actually seeing quite serious distinction between the four banks. They've all got identities, both in terms of how they relate to customers and also what sort of returns they deliver to shareholders. You've got the CBA right at the top and you've got the NAB right at the bottom.